Hello, Tim Hughes here. I'm the CEO and co-founder of DLA Ignite. Welcome. And today we're going to talk to John Dawes, and we're going to talk about Net Promoter Score. What is it? Should you be using it? The advantages and disadvantages of it. But I want to welcome John from all the way from Australia, which is the other side of the world.
Indeed.
John, welcome.
Thank you very much, Tim. Lovely to be here.
Find you.
People can find me on LinkedIn. So just search John Dawes on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter at John G. Dawes. And you'll notice the owl in the background. So I'm one of the senior researchers or one of the associate directors of the Ehrenberg-Bass Institute. So if you search Ehrenberg-Bass, you'll find myself and indeed all of my colleagues on the Ehrenberg-Bass website as well.
And just to say, we've already had a comment in from Sam Dawes saying, and I understand this is your daughter.
That's correct. That's right.
Thank you, Sam. So, John, Net Promoter Score. What on earth is it?
Well, so what is Net Promoter Score? It's a metric that was devised by a person called Reichheld, who was a senior figure at the Bain consultancy company. And he developed the metric and said it's the one number you need to grow. So it's a metric that taps people's likelihood to recommend a brand. So people are asked in the survey, you're a customer of United Airlines or you're a Peugeot owner. What's the likelihood you would recommend that brand to a friend or colleague from 0 to 10, where 0 is not at all and 10 is extremely likely. So that's the basis of the Net Promoter Score. It's at its heart, it's a question around recommendation, but it's used as sort of a proxy for loyalty. So Reichheld argued the ultimate manifestation of loyalty is to be prepared to recommend a brand. It's used as a quasi-satisfaction measure, and it's also used as an indicator of future word of mouth, positive word of mouth in the marketplace.
Because I'm through the powers of the internet, I'm a Virgin Media user, and in the unlikely event that we have a problem, which is very, very rarely, whenever I ring up and ask on what's going on, I will always get an email like 2 or 3 days later saying, how likely are you to recommend us, with a 0 to 10? Is that what NPS is?
Yes, that's the basis of the NPS. And then the NPS stands for Net Promoter Score. So what Reichheld said was, well, what we'll do is we'll only be really interested in the people who give you a 9 or a 10. They're the people who'll be really likely to recommend. The 7s and the 8s, we'll just take them out. And then the 0s to 6s, he said, well, they're detractors. And what we'll do is we'll subtract the proportion of detractors from the proportion of the 9s and 10s, the promoters, and the end result is the Net Promoter Score. And so what that means is you start off with a question from 0 to 10. By the time you do that subtraction, you wind up with a score that ranges from -100 to 100. So and so I think this was, I guess, a clever aspect of the design of the NPS is that it is dramatic. So one of the issues that market research companies and insights managers have is a lot of the times the surveys that they do, they're reasonably stable from period to period, and so they're not very exciting. You do a customer satisfaction survey, which I'm a fan of, but they're often stable. 4.5 out of 5, or 7.5 out of 10, 8 out of 10, can be a bit boring for the company. But the sort of cunning beauty of the Net Promoter is that you can get dramatically low scores. So there's a famous quote: everybody in the management meeting wakes up when you tell them that we get 10 out of 100. People go like, what, 10 out of 100? That's shocking. So, we need to do something about it. So the idea is it gives you a confronting metric that prompts people to try and take action. Senior management want to know why we're getting 10 out of 100 or even a minus score. There are some big corporations that get -7 on their NPS, and I guess people in management must get some heat about that, and they're forced to try and do something about it.
I've got your paper here, the Net Promoter Score. What should managers know?
Yes.
And you can see I've underlined a whole load of stuff.
Yes.
It's a fantastic read, because you point out that people like JetBlue, Southwest Airlines, Barclays, HSBC, NatWest, which are all banks in the UK, all use NPS, or report it in their, or have reported it in their annual reports at some point.
Yes. Yes, that's right. So, I mean, the Net Promoter Score was marketed extremely well, or was promoted really well. So it came out in a the idea came out in a Harvard Business Review article. There was a book about it. Reichelt was a pretty prominent figure, and it's been like, there's a huge industry that actually promotes the Net Promoter. And I think a news article said something like 2/3 of Fortune 500 companies use it, and in a sense, it's widely used because everybody uses it. So you have a senior manager goes from one company to another. What do? They say, well, oh, you don't use Net Promoter here. Well, let's bring that in with all the attendant, software services and survey, infrastructure to bring it into a new company. So it's certainly very prevalent, widely used, but also another recent magazine article, I think in Fortune, called it a dubious management fad that was sweeping America. And the reason for that is that there is, it was sold on the basis that it is the one number that you need to grow. If you can turn your customers into acolytes and they'll recommend you to friends and colleagues, then in a sense you are benefiting from the equivalent of a marketing department. Your customers are doing your work for free. People listen to friends and colleagues when they recommend. So it's been sold as a lead indicator of growth. As you would have seen in my research study, I spent some years patiently assembling Net Promoter Scores for all sorts of publicly listed companies and matching them with their growth rates. And I couldn't find that Net Promoter is a lead indicator of growth. To me, it seemed more along the lines it was a reflection of current growth, or possibly even past growth. So it could be some companies have grown, they've attracted a whole lot of new customers, and like being a new customer of a firm is somewhat more newsworthy than being an old customer of a firm. So in the UK, if you've used Barclays for 10 years, you're not going to turn around and start recommending it. But if you've just started using Starling, a new bank and a new bank model, then that's a little bit more newsworthy and probably maybe more likely something you'll tell your friends. But it still could be the past growth is actually driving the Net Promoter, not the other way around.
Yes, and it could be that the customers of a challenger bank like Starling are more likely to be online and
Yes.
give a review rather than the Barclays. I mean, in your paper, you mentioned that Net Promoter Score is 1, it's presumed a link to business growth. 2, the assumption that low Net Promoter Scores indicate negative word of mouth.
Yes.
3, the weak association between stated likelihood of recommended and actual recommending. And 4, the claim that NPS is a superior metric to customer satisfaction.
Yes, that's right. So yes, I looked at all 4 of those in the paper. So Net Promoter was sold on the basis that it's a superior measure to customer satisfaction, and that was on the basis that Reichelt said, well, they observed that many satisfied customers defect, therefore satisfaction isn't telling you what you need. But the thing is, in all the work that I've done and all the other published research on this, actually Net Promoter Scores for firms correlate really, really highly with customer satisfaction scores. At something like 0.8, it's a very high correlation. So in actual fact, if you're tracking customer satisfaction, the Net Promoter Score isn't actually telling you that much in incremental information. You could take a pretty good guess at what your Net Promoter Score will be based on knowing whether you're getting a really high or low customer satisfaction score.
I mean, one of the things that you mentioned in the paper, which is interesting, which is, I read out 4 items that you could be measuring.
Yes.
That seems to be your there seems to be a lot of things that you're measuring just on the fact that you've sent Tim Hughes an email saying, are you satisfied with our service, like from 0 to 10?
Yes, that's right. So, so there are some issues with asking people about likelihood to recommend in terms of how people interpret that question, and then possibly how the response is interpreted. So, I mean, there's actually there's an internet meme going around that somebody was asked, how likely are you to recommend Windows 11? And the answer was 0. And then like, why did you give that score? And the answer was, I need you to understand that people don't randomly go around talking about operating systems. So there is a bit of an issue in that if people give you a high score on the Net Promoter question, it's probably a good indication that they're pretty happy, that they're pretty satisfied, but it's certainly not an indication that they're going to recommend. Okay, so likelihood to recommend is not necessarily the same thing as recommendation, because research on word of mouth recommendation has found that a key driver of actual recommendation is whether I perceive that you actually could benefit or that you need my recommendation. So, if I've recently migrated to Windows 11 or I've bought a new vacuum cleaner, unless I think that you really need to know anything about that, then it's not going to come up in conversation. So there can be a problem with the interpretation of the Net Promoter question, in that, if you're a firm and you're getting high scores, you could be forgiven for thinking, well, great, there's actually a lot of positive word of mouth out there about my brand, but that's not necessarily the case. It's probably indicating your customers are happy, but that's not the same as saying that there's a lot of positive word of mouth about you out in the marketplace, because that can depend on what sort of market you're in, whether it's the sort of market that people talk about, like, I don't know, car tires. People don't talk about them. Movies and restaurants, people do. So word of mouth is, has a dramatically different importance depending on the industry. So you need to kind of contextualize that in the use of things like Net Promoter.
Yeah, I must admit, I've never had a conversation with anybody much about car tires.
Exactly. And yet, if a typical person is surveyed and they're saying, you've put some, Olympic or some Goodyear tires on your car, are you pretty happy with them? Yes. Would you recommend them to friends or colleagues? A lot of people will say, well, yes, 10, because they're being, they're being consistent with, I've just told you that I'm happy with them. So yes, I probably would promote them. I would tell other people about them, but in reality, they're never going to discuss their car tires with somebody else, because it's not a newsworthy conversation topic.
Do you think it's because people are, organizations are always trying to search for some sort of benchmark?
For sure.
Because with NPS, in effect, what you're able to do is say, if I'm Barclays, I can compare myself to NatWest because we're both banks.
Yes, indeed.
And we're always seeking some sort of benchmark and clarity on where we are, aren't we?
Indeed. So yeah, managers are interested in benchmarks. They're certainly, exposed to a lot of marketing material and collateral that telling them that recommendation is a route to growth. This is how you should, monitor it and track it. So you can see that there's a great sort of selling story about it. And yes, if I'm Barclays, I want to know, well, how well am I doing against NatWest or Santander or whatever? And so yes, within industry, benchmarking certainly is important. There are a whole host of providers that sell those benchmarks. Benchmarks are important because they help you to sort of understand what's achievable. Like if I'm in retail, the average NPS scores for retailers are around about 60, whereas for say healthcare, it's down around 40 in the UK. So if I'm in healthcare, what that tells me is, I've got to set targets for, things like recommendation scores or Net Promoter that would be, about feasible for my industry. I'm not going to set an objective to get 80 if I'm in an industry that averages 40. That would be crazy. So yes, understanding industry benchmarks is important for, word of mouth or recommendation metrics, just as it is for satisfaction or other, behavioral loyalty metrics. Industry context is important.
So in terms of that, how do you bring that into your broader customer experience, customer service type strategy? Because if you're in retail and you've got promoter score of, did you say 40? If you train all your people in the store to be helpful and know where all the products are, and if you're more, that's something that you can use to raise the overall net promoter score, isn't it?
That's certainly the idea. The fact that there are kind of industry bands suggests that there are upper limits to what you can do, based on the industry. There are certain things that are feasible. But yes, you should certainly pay attention to all aspects of customer experience. And that goes from pre-purchase inquiry phases to customer handling and onboarding to post-purchase and after-sales care. There are a whole spectrum of interactions and touch points which you should be aware of, and you should get customers' opinions on how well you've performed with all of those. And what a lot of firms do is they'll do a fairly comprehensive customer experience survey, and then on the end of it, they'll ask what is often called a global question, like overall, rate us on customer satisfaction or likelihood to recommend, and then they'll try and do some statistical modeling to try and tease out which are the most important drivers. So, that's I guess where Net Promoter fits into a broader customer experience strategy. Is it? I guess it gives you something to try and understand what are the aspects of your, touch points and interactions with customers that seem to drive variation in these overall scores.
Because in your document, in the summary, you say that there is mixed evidence concerning the presumed link between NPS and firm growth.
Yes.
Evidence suggests low NPS scores do not necessarily have the outcome of negative word of mouth.
Yes.
More evidence is needed relating to how NPS scores translate to actual recommendation behavior. And
Yes.
4, NPS does not appear to be a superior metric to satisfaction to predicting business growth. In fact, evidence suggests NPS functions more as a proxy of customer satisfaction than being an indicator of loyalty or word of mouth.
Yes, that's right. So yes, some research done about follow-up surveys, people who gave low or high likelihood to recommend scores. They found the majority of people who said they were very likely to recommend didn't, and it also found people who gave low likelihood to recommend scores. They didn't give positive word of mouth, but they didn't give negative word of mouth either. So, Reichheld assumed that a low NPS, question score meant that you were a detractor, but in actual fact, it doesn't necessarily mean that at all. In fact, there's reasonably low levels of negative word of mouth amongst the brand's current customer base. And yes, in relation to the link between Net Promoter scores and future growth. So in Reicheld's book, they said, look, we had a Bain team comb through dozens of industries, hundreds of firms, and we found, a link between the higher the Net Promoter score, the higher your growth in the coming years. But close inspection of that work, well, only about half a dozen industries were shown, so that makes you wonder about, well, what were the results for all the ones that weren't shown? So maybe it's open to the idea that maybe there was a bit of cherry picking, but also other researchers have said, well, but hang on a minute, you've actually got the time period for the growth rate was actually before the Net Promoter scores were obtained. So the Net Promoter can't drive or cause growth if it's like post dating the growth. So it actually seemed to suggest that it was a better explanation is past or present growth is actually inducing high Net Promoter scores rather than the other way around. And that's consistent with what I've been finding over the last 3 years of doing research on this.
And so what? Finally, what do you see as the future for NPS?
I think to be honest, I think it's probably peaked, and it might perhaps decline a little bit. I think there's a reasonably good logic to say, look, if you're a firm and you're really interested in customer sentiment and how well you're doing with customers, then really what you're interested in then is customer satisfaction. So why not ask customer satisfaction rather than using the proxy of likelihood to recommend instead? Secondly, if you think that word of mouth recommendation is important in your industry, then why not ask about actual recommendation rather than likelihood to recommend, right? So, it would be easy to survey people, new customers, existing customers, etc. In the last month or in the last 2 months, have you recommended positively or negatively, our firm to friends or colleagues? And that would help you to understand, is it, in any given month, is like 2% of my customer base saying something positively about me, or is it 6%, or is it 9%, or what is it? And you could start to figure out, for instance, your share of the recommendations that are going on in the industry, right? So let's say I'm a 5% market share brand. Am I getting about 5% of all the positive recommendations out there? I should be, ideally I'd want to get my fair share. If I'm overperforming, that would be good news, because that's telling me that would be a lead indicator of growth. And if I'm a 5% share brand with 2% of the recommendations, that would tell me, well, maybe that's something I need to look into to try and address. And then lastly, if we have time, Net Promoter is primarily predicated on the idea of, understanding what your current customer base thinks about you, which is fine. You want to understand what your current customer base thinks about you. But decades of research on how brands actually grow is they grow by attracting new customers, right? The size of the customer base increases. Well, you can't really pick that up from asking your current customer base. So the idea is to look at metrics that are more sensitive to understanding the potential among non-customers. So two new metrics that we talk a lot about at Ehrenberg-Bass Institute are what we call mental availability. So the extent to which your brand is easy to think of amongst the buying population, like does it come to mind over a range of cues for lots of people? And secondly, is it easy to buy? Is it easy to come across this brand when people are perusing the category or thinking about buying the category? And once they've decided to buy the category, is it in all the right places and is it prominent in the right places? We think, so those two metrics are actually the key thing that distinguishes big brands from small brands. So we kind of think perhaps the world will start moving a little bit more towards better understanding mental and physical availability and maybe starting to de-emphasize metrics like Net Promoter.
John, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us today. It's a fascinating subject, and really
pleasure.
Appreciate you coming on and sharing not just your thoughts and your opinions, but your research paper as well. So thank you.
Yes,
please remind people where they can get hold of you.
For sure. So I'm a senior researcher and associate director at the Ehrenberg-Bass Institute, but you can also find me on LinkedIn, and I'm on Twitter as at JohnDawes. So I look forward to seeing you on social media.
Thank you so much, John, for talking to us today and sharing your insight.
My pleasure.